In the rarefied air of Julian Croft's world, emotions were liabilities, and human connection was a variable to be managed, not felt. He was a man who didn't just own skyscrapers. He commanded the digital ether, the invisible architecture of modern life. Yet, in the face of his own 10-year-old son, Thomas, he was powerless. What happens when a titan of technology, a man who sees the world in code and algorithms, witnesses a struggling waitress decipher the silent, intricate language of his non-verbal autistic son? This is not merely a story of two worlds colliding. It is a descent into a labyrinth of corporate ambition, devastating betrayal, and a terrifying secret that will either forge an unbreakable family or shatter their lives into 1,000,000 irreparable pieces. Prepare to discover how a simple drawing on a napkin could expose a rot at the heart of $1 billion empire and ignite a love powerful enough to burn it all down. The relentless chime of crystal against fine china was a discordant symphony that grated on Julian Croft's nerves. He despised Aurelia. The restaurant his publicist insisted was the pinnacle of understated elegance. To Julian, it was a mausoleum of haute cuisine, each dish a ridiculously expensive piece of art designed to be photographed, not eaten. He preferred the clean, binary certainty of his office, the hum of servers processing trillions of bytes of data. That was a world he understood, a world he controlled. His gaze, sharp and analytical, fell upon the boy across the vast expanse of the white linen tablecloth. Thomas, his son, his brilliant, beautiful, silent enigma. The boy's world was a fortress built of silence and solitude, and Julian, for all his wealth and influence, had failed to find even a crack in its walls. Thomas's eyes, a startling shade of stormy grey so like his own, were not on his untouched plate of deconstructed scallops, but on the crisp paper napkin beside it. In his hand, a black fountain pen moved with a life of its own, its nib scratching out a complex, labyrinthine pattern. It was a single, unbroken line, folding in on itself, creating corridors and dead ends, a maze of breathtaking complexity. This was Thomas's comfort, his obsession, and the most visceral symbol of the gulf between them. "Thomas, the chef prepared that, especially for you," Julian said. His voice was the one he used in boardrooms, calm, measured, and accustomed to immediate obedience. It was a voice that could make markets tremble. Thomas offered no response. The pen didn't even falter. The maze grew, sprawling across the pristine white space, a silent, intricate monologue Julian couldn't comprehend. A sigh, sharp with a frustration he detested in himself, escaped Julian's lips. It had been 3 years since his wife, Eleanor, had been taken from them by a swift and merciless illness. 3 years of this echoing, suffocating silence. He had done what he always did when faced with a problem. He'd thrown resources at it. A phalanx of the world's leading therapists, neurologists, and educators. A dedicated nanny with a doctorate in developmental psychology. They'd all come back with the same reports, filled with jargon like profoundly gifted spatial reasoning and severe communication deficits. They had catalogued the problem, but none could solve it. None had found the key. He was about to issue another pointless command when a quiet voice cut through his frustration. "I'm sorry to interrupt, sir. Is everything to your liking?" Julian looked up, his annoyance poorly masked. It was a waitress. She couldn't have been much older than 20, with tired but intelligent eyes the color of moss after a rain. Her name tag, slightly askew on her simple black uniform, read Clara. She had a cascade of unruly auburn hair, pulled back in a loose knot, and she held herself with a certain defiant grace that suggested she was unimpressed by the opulence surrounding her. "Everything is fine," he clipped, his tone a clear dismissal. He wanted her gone. He wanted this entire performative father-son dinner to be over so he could retreat to the sterile comfort of his penthouse. But Clara's gaze hadn't been on him. It had shifted to the napkin, to the intricate maze Thomas was creating. She didn't look at his son with the usual blend of pity and confusion Julian had grown to expect. Instead, her eyes, framed by a light dusting of freckles, held a look of intense, scholarly concentration. She saw the drawing not as a symptom, but as a text. "That's a Cretan labyrinth," she said, her voice a soft murmur, almost to herself. "The classical, single-path design. Remarkable." Julian froze. He'd heard 1,000 diagnoses, but never an art history classification. Thomas's pen stopped. For the first time all evening, the boy's head lifted, his grey eyes fixing on Clara. It was a tectonic shift, a moment so profound in its rarity that the air in Julian's lungs seemed to solidify. Clara, sensing the shift, took a half-step closer. She didn't look at Thomas, but kept her eyes on the drawing, showing respect for his creation. "The beauty of the Cretan design is that it's not a puzzle," she continued, her voice gentle, almost academic. "It looks complex, but if you just keep walking, the path always leads you to the center. It's a journey, not a trap." Before Julian could process what was happening, she pulled a small notepad and a pen from her apron pocket. On a fresh sheet, she quickly sketched something. It wasn't a maze. It was a small, stylized symbol, like a pictograph from some forgotten civilization. She slid the notepad onto the table, next to Thomas's napkin. "Every labyrinth needs a minotaur at its center," she said, with a small, wry smile. "Or maybe a treasure." Thomas stared at the symbol she had drawn. His fingers, long and elegant, traced its shape in the air. He looked at his own labyrinth, then back at her symbol. And then, the impossible occurred. He picked up his own pen, and at the very center of his intricate maze, he replicated her symbol perfectly. A silent, symbolic conversation had just taken place. An idea conveyed, understood, and answered. Julian Croft, a man who could bend the digital world to his will, who could anticipate market trends months in advance, was utterly and completely adrift. His heart, a fortress of logic and grief, felt a seismic tremor. A deep, foundational crack had just appeared in the bedrock of his understanding of the world. Clara's moss-green eyes finally met his over Thomas's head. There was no pride in her gaze, only a shared awe. "He's not just drawing," she whispered, as if imparting a sacred truth. "He's communicating. That's a language." In that instant, Julian didn't see a waitress earning $12 an hour. He saw a Rosetta Stone. He saw a flicker of brilliant, blinding light in the suffocating darkness that had become his life. He saw the first person who had not tried to fix his son, but had simply bothered to listen to what he was already saying. The fortress around Julian's heart did not crumble that day, but a single, impossibly resilient wildflower had just forced its way through a fissure in the granite. He knew, with a terrifying certainty that rattled his very core, that he had to see this woman again. It wasn't about hope, he told himself, clinging to the familiar logic of his world. It was about a problem. Thomas was the problem. And this woman, this Clara, might be the solution. An asset he could acquire, a tool he could utilize. He was wrong, of course. He was catastrophically, beautifully wrong. But he wouldn't understand the depth of his miscalculation until much, much later. For now, he just watched as his meticulously ordered world began to tilt on its axis, while a waitress and his silent son shared a secret language in the heart of a gilded cage. The following Thursday, Julian Croft broke a routine, that had been etched in stone for over a decade. He cancelled his 2 p.m. meeting with the board of Ethelred Technologies. He postponed a transatlantic call that would have sealed a 9-figure acquisition. He delegated these tasks to Richard Vale, his COO, and the man who had been his shadow for 15 years, all for a lunch he had no intention of tasting. He was seated at the same table at Aurelia, the opulent decor feeling less like a prison and more like a staging ground. He had, of course, called ahead. It was a simple matter for his assistant to ensure that Clara would be their designated server. Thomas sat beside him, not drawing this time, but carefully arranging a series of sugar cubes into a complex, geometric pattern. His focus was absolute, a world contained within the 4-inch space in front of him. When Clara arrived, her smile was hesitant, professional. She carried herself with a cautious awareness that her last interaction with them had breached the normal boundary between server and patron. "Welcome back, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice carefully neutral. Her eyes, however, flickered to Thomas, and a genuine warmth softened her expression. "And hello to the artist." Thomas didn't look up, but the rhythmic placement of his sugar cubes paused for a single, significant beat. For Julian, who had spent years decoding his son's subtle cues, it was as loud as a shout. "He seems calmer," Julian found himself admitting, the words feeling foreign and vulnerable. He was a man who solved problems, not one who admitted to their complexities. "He has a lot to say," Clara replied simply, placing a glass of apple juice in front of Thomas without being asked. She turned her attention to Julian. "The usual, Mr. Croft. Black coffee, and you'll pretend to read the menu for exactly 8 minutes before ordering the seared tuna salad, dressing on the side." Julian was taken aback. He was a creature of habit, a predictability he weaponized in negotiations. But for this young woman to have catalogued his behavior so precisely from a handful of brief encounters was both unnerving and deeply intriguing. He felt seen, not as a billionaire, but as a man. "You're observant," he stated. It was not a compliment. It was a diagnosis. "It's part of the job," she said, with a slight shrug. "But I also think it's important to pay attention. Really pay attention. You'd be amazed what you can learn when you stop trying to manage the conversation." Her gaze flickered meaningfully toward Thomas. Throughout the meal, an unspoken tension hummed between them. Julian, accustomed to being in command, found himself in the unfamiliar position of needing something he couldn't simply buy. Clara, for her part, performed her duties with flawless efficiency, yet there was a new boundary in her eyes, a professional wall she had erected since their last encounter. Finally, as she cleared their plates, Julian decided to breach it. "I want to make you a proposal." Clara's eyebrows rose slightly. "A proposal?" "I want to hire you," he said, the words coming out more bluntly than he'd intended, sounding like a transaction. "To work with Thomas, as a companion, a translator." Her warm expression instantly chilled. "Mr. Croft, I'm a waitress and a student. I'm not a therapist." "The therapists have failed," he countered, leaning forward, his voice dropping. "They come in with their clipboards and their theories, and they see a collection of symptoms. You saw a person. You saw a language. What you did the other day was more of a breakthrough than I've seen in 3 years." He paused, forcing himself to do something he rarely did. Show weakness. "I don't know how to reach him. I think you do." Clara studied him for a long moment, her green eyes searching his. He could see the conflict in them, the skepticism, the caution, but also a flicker of genuine compassion for the boy. "What do you think I am, Mr. Croft? Some kind of miracle worker? I don't believe in miracles, Julian said flatly. I believe in data, and the data from our last interaction is compelling. You established a connection. I want to understand how. I'll pay you 10 times what you make here. 20 times. Name your price. She shook her head, a look of profound disappointment clouding her features. You still don't get it, do you? You think this is an asset that can be acquired. What happened the other day wasn't a transaction. It was a moment of mutual respect between two people. You can't write a check for that. She turned to leave, and a cold, unfamiliar panic seized Julian. He was losing her. He was losing the only lead he'd had in years. "Wait," he called out, his voice sharper than he intended, laced with an uncharacteristic desperation. Clara paused, her back still to him. "Please," he said, the word feeling like a foreign object on his tongue. It wouldn't be a job. Not like that. It would be helping. Helping a boy who is lost in his own head, who needs someone who understands that his mazes aren't a symptom, they're a map. For the first time, he wasn't negotiating. He was pleading. She turned slowly, her gaze softening. She saw past the tailored suit and the aura of power. She saw a father, adrift and afraid. "I'm studying historical linguistics and symbology at Columbia," she said quietly. "My focus is on pre-alphabetic communication. Pictographs, petroglyphs, lost languages. I spend my days trying to understand how people communicated before they had words. When I saw what your son was drawing, it wasn't just a pattern. It felt familiar. It had structure, syntax. The revelation hung in the air between them, a fragile bridge of understanding. Julian finally understood. It wasn't a lucky guess or some innate maternal instinct. It was knowledge. It was a specific, unique skill set that he never would have thought to look for. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "On 2 conditions." "Anything," he said, relief washing over him. "First, this isn't about money. You will pay me the standard rate for a specialist tutor. Not a cent more. I will not be bought." Second, she looked him directly in the eye, her gaze unflinching. "You have to be there for every session. No phones, no distractions. If you want to learn how to talk to your son, you have to be in the room to learn the language." It was a simple request, but for Julian Croft, it was a revolution. An hour of his undivided attention was a commodity more precious than any stock in his portfolio. "Done," he said without hesitation. As Clara walked away, Julian looked at his son, who was now placing the final sugar cube on his intricate structure. A perfect, symmetrical ziggurat. A silent testament to a world of order and beauty that Julian was only just beginning to perceive. He realized his offer of money had been a test, not for her, but for himself. And he had almost failed it spectacularly. The path forward was a terra incognita. There were no contracts to govern this arrangement, no performance metrics to track. There was only a promise to be present. And for the first time in a very long time, Julian Croft felt a flicker of something that wasn't control or power. It was terrifying, exhilarating, and utterly alien. It was hope. But far away, in the glass and steel canyons of his own empire, Richard Vale was taking note of his boss's erratic schedule and unusual focus on a downtown restaurant. A seed of suspicion, small and dark and deeply ambitious, had just been planted. And in the sterile soil of the corporate world, it was about to grow into something monstrous. The sessions began not in the sterile environment of a therapist's office, but in the vast, sun-drenched library of Julian's penthouse. It was a room Eleanor had designed, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park and shelves filled with books she'd never had the chance to read. For 3 years it had been a silent, dust-free memorial. Now it was a classroom. Clara was a revelation. She didn't arrive with a briefcase full of exercises, but with sketch pads, charcoal, and books filled with images of ancient Minoan pottery and Sumerian cuneiform. She never spoke down to Thomas. Instead, she treated him as an intellectual peer. "The core of any language, Thomas," she'd say, her voice a calm, steady presence in the quiet room, "is a shared set of symbols and a consistent grammar. Your mazes are the grammar. They are the structure. Now we need to build the vocabulary." She would draw a simple symbol, a circle with a dot in the center, and point to a glass of water. Then she would wait. For the first 2 sessions, Thomas simply watched her, his expression unreadable. Julian felt the old frustration creeping back, the impatient urge to make something happen. But he held his tongue, honoring his promise. He sat in a leather armchair, his phone off, and simply observed. It was the hardest work he had ever done. The breakthrough came on the 3rd day. Clara had drawn the symbol for water again. Thomas picked up a piece of charcoal, and next to her symbol he drew his own, a series of wavy, parallel lines. Then he looked directly at Clara and pushed the glass of water towards her. It was a sentence. "This is my symbol for water. Do you want it?" Clara's smile was radiant. "Thank you, Thomas. I understand." She then drew her symbol for apple and pushed a red apple towards him. Thomas responded by drawing a perfect spiral. Julian watched, mesmerized. It was like watching 2 explorers mapping a new continent. They were building a dictionary, one symbol at a time. He learned that Thomas's world was not chaotic, but exquisitely ordered. A spiral meant food. A triangle with a line through it meant outside. A complex grid of intersecting lines was his symbol for his father. Structured, complex, hard to navigate. The first time Clara deciphered that one, Julian had to leave the room, a lump the size of a fist lodged in his throat. He began to see his son in a new light, not as a collection of deficits, but as a mind that operated on a different frequency, a mind that saw the world in patterns and symbols, in a language more ancient and fundamental than words. And he began to see Clara differently too. He saw the fierce intelligence behind her quiet demeanor. He learned about her life, the scholarship that barely covered her tuition, the second job she worked at a bookstore to help her grandmother with rent, her passion for uncovering the lost stories of the past. He found himself looking forward to their sessions, not just for Thomas, but for the hour of quiet sanity Clara brought into his life. Her presence was a balm on the jagged edges of his grief and frustration. One afternoon, after a particularly productive session, where Thomas had successfully created a symbol for sad, a maze with a broken path, Julian asked her to stay for dinner. They ate on the terrace, the city lights twinkling below like a fallen constellation. "Tell me about Eleanor," Clara asked gently, her question cutting through the polite surface of their conversation. The defenses went up instantly. Julian's posture stiffened. "What's to tell? She was my wife. She passed away." "Thomas draws her symbol sometimes," Clara said, her gaze steady. "It's a single perfect circle with a star inside. He draws it when he looks at the garden she planted on the east terrace." She paused. "The silence in this apartment isn't just his, Julian. It's yours, too. You've locked her away." "You don't know anything about me," he snapped, the words sharper than he'd intended. "I know that you've built a fortress around yourself that's more intricate than any of Thomas's mazes," she retorted, her voice firm but not unkind. "And you're teaching your son that grief is something to be hidden. that love is something to be locked away in a room you never enter. Her audacity was breathtaking. No one spoke to him this way. But her words struck a chord of truth so profound it resonated deep within him. He had created a museum to his wife, not a home for his son. In his effort to shield himself from the pain, he had denied Thomas the comfort of memory. Swallowing the shard of grief that was always in his throat, he began to speak. She loved the stars, he said, his voice thick. She was an astrophysicist before Ethelred took off. She used to say the universe was the only thing bigger than my ego. A small, sad smile touched his lips. She would have loved you. She would have understood what you're doing for him. With every story he told, he felt a layer of ice melt. He was sharing his grief, and in doing so, he was halving its weight. He was also, he realized with a jolt, falling for her. It wasn't just gratitude. It was her courage, her intellect, her unwavering moral compass. It was the way she looked at his son, not as a project, but as a gift. But their burgeoning sanctuary was being watched. Richard Vale saw the daily sessions not as a breakthrough, but as an infiltration. He saw Julian's softening demeanor as a weakness. For 15 years, Richard had been the loyal soldier, the ruthless pragmatist who did the dirty work that kept the Ethelred Empire pristine. He had sacrificed his personal life for the company. He believed he was the true heir to Julian's vision, not a silent, defective child. And this waitress was a threat to all of it. He did what he did best. He gathered data. He hired a private investigator, a discreet firm that specialized in digging up the kind of dirt that could ruin lives. They scoured Clara's past, her finances, her family, and they found a pressure point. Clara's grandmother, the woman who had raised her, was in a nursing home. Her health was failing, and the costs were astronomical. Clara was funneling every spare dollar she had into her care, forgoing her own needs, living on the razor's edge of financial ruin. The investigator also discovered something else. The nursing home was owned by a subsidiary of a rival tech corporation, a company Richard knew was vulnerable to a hostile takeover. Richard smiled. It was a cold, calculating expression. He had found his weapon. A week later, Clara received a frantic call from the nursing home administrator. There had been a billing error. Her grandmother's account was in arrears by a shocking amount. If it wasn't paid in full within 72 hours, she would be evicted. Panicked, Clara called her grandmother, who was in tears, confused and terrified. Desperate, Clara knew there was only one person she could turn to who could help. Swallowing her pride, she went to Julian. She found him in his home office, staring at a stock ticker. She explained the situation, her voice trembling with shame and fear. Julian listened, his expression unreadable. Then he did something that shattered her. "How much?" he asked, his voice cool, distant. She told him the amount. He swiveled in his chair, typed a few commands into his computer, and a moment later, a printer whirred. He handed her a cashier's check for the full amount. "Here," he said, not meeting her eyes. "A bonus. For your excellent work with Thomas." The words, meant to be kind, felt like a slap. He was her employer again, not her friend. He was solving her problem with money, creating a debt, re-establishing the power dynamic between them. The intimacy they had shared on the terrace felt like a distant dream. "Julian, she started, but he cut her off. "It's done, Clara. Just a business expense. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a call." She left the penthouse, the check clutched in her hand, feeling colder and more alone than ever. She had let her guard down, and he had reminded her exactly where she stood. She was an employee, an asset, a tool he was utilizing. What she didn't see was the look on Julian's face after she left. The conflict, the self-loathing. He was terrified of the feelings she evoked in him, terrified of being vulnerable again. Falling back into the familiar role of the provider, the problem solver, was a defense mechanism. It was easier to write a check than to offer a piece of his heart. And in his own office across town, Richard Vale reviewed the report from his investigator. Phase 1 was complete. He had driven a wedge between them. He had reminded Julian that the girl came from a world of desperation and need. Now it was time for Phase 2. He picked up the phone and made a call to a disgruntled former employee of Ethelred's chief rival. "I have a proposition for you," Richard said, his voice smooth as polished steel. "It involves a young woman named Clara Collins, and a story that will make her look like the most cunning corporate spy in modern history." The game had just escalated. He wasn't just trying to get rid of Clara. He was going to destroy her. The check felt like a block of ice in Clara's pocket. She deposited it, paid the nursing home, and endured her grandmother's tearful gratitude. But the relief was tainted with a bitter sense of humiliation. The easy intimacy she and Julian had been building had vanished, replaced by a formal, professional distance. He was polite, even complimentary about her work with Thomas, but the warmth was gone. He was the billionaire again, and she was the help. The sessions with Thomas became her only refuge. Their silent language had grown in complexity and nuance. Thomas could now express abstract thoughts, tell stories through sequences of symbols. He was creating a world on paper, a world full of impossible creatures and fantastical architecture. He was happy, and for Clara, that was the only thing that mattered. 2 weeks after the incident with the check, the world exploded. Clara woke up to her phone buzzing incessantly. A friend had sent her a link to a major financial news site. The headline was a gut punch. "The Ethelred Lark, how a waitress turned tutor may be at the center of a multi-billion-dollar corporate espionage scandal." The article was a masterpiece of insinuation and carefully selected half-truths. It detailed her sudden employment by the reclusive Julian Croft. It painted her as a woman with a mysterious past and a sudden, inexplicable access to one of the most powerful men in tech. It mentioned her family's financial struggles, framing them as a motive. The centerpiece of the article was an interview with a disgruntled former programmer from a rival company, Omnicorp. He claimed he had been meeting secretly with Clara, that she had been feeding him information about Ethelred's top-secret Project Chimera. He even produced emails, cleverly forged but utterly convincing, that seemed to corroborate his story. The final, devastating blow was the mention of the large sum of money recently transferred from Julian's personal account to hers. It was presented as payment for her services as a spy. Richard's plan was diabolical in its elegance. He hadn't just framed her. He had used Julian's own clumsy attempt at kindness as the murder weapon. Clara felt the floor drop out from beneath her. Her world shrank to the four corners of her tiny apartment, the accusatory glow of her phone screen illuminating her face. She was no longer a person. She was a headline, a villain in a story she hadn't written. The call from Julian's assistant came an hour later. It was brief and cold. Her services were no longer required. She was not to contact Mr. Croft or his son. A legal team would be in touch. The silence that followed was more deafening than any shout. She thought of Thomas. Who would understand his spirals and mazes now? Who would listen to his silent stories? The thought of him, alone again in that vast, empty penthouse, was a pain sharper than her own public humiliation. In his office high above the city, Julian stared at the article, a storm of ice and fury raging within him. Every cynical instinct he possessed was roaring to life. He had been played. This woman, with her gentle eyes and her academic theories, had been the most sophisticated grifter he had ever encountered. She had exploited his son, his grief, his one moment of weakness, the connection he'd felt, the vulnerability he'd shown. It had all been a lie, a carefully constructed illusion to gain his trust. Richard Vale stood before his desk, the very picture of grim loyalty. "I'm sorry, Julian," he said, his voice heavy with feigned sympathy. "I ran a deep background check on her as soon as you brought her on. I had a bad feeling. The report came in this morning. It's all there. The connections to Omnicorp, the secret meetings. The programmer is willing to testify. We've been compromised. Fix it," Julian snarled, his voice a low growl. "Kill the story. Sue them into oblivion, and make sure she never works in this city again." "Of course," Richard said smoothly. "But the damage to Project Chimera might be irreversible. Omnicorp could beat us to market." He let the implication hang in the air. The project, a revolutionary AI, was Julian's legacy. Julian's face was a mask of cold fury. He had allowed an emotional attachment to create a liability, just as Marcus had once warned him in the old transcript. He had let his judgment be clouded. He would not make that mistake again. He would cut out the cancer, cauterize the wound, and move on. He retreated behind the fortress of his logic, the cold, hard calculus of damage control. But that night, as he sat alone in the library, the silence was different. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of before. It was the dead, empty silence of absence. On the table lay a sketchpad Clara had left behind. On the top page was a new symbol Thomas had created that last afternoon. It was a complex grid, his symbol for his father, with a single, perfect circle, his symbol for his mother, placed right in the center. But inside the circle, where the star used to be, he had drawn the symbol Clara used for herself, the stylized Minotaur. Clara is the heart of our family. Julian stared at the drawing, and for the first time, a sliver of doubt pierced his armor of rage. The story in the news was neat, logical. It fit all the facts. But it didn't fit this. It didn't fit the look in Thomas's eyes when Clara entered a room. It didn't fit the quiet courage of a woman who had demanded respect, not money. His mind, trained to see patterns, began to churn. The billing error at the nursing home, the convenient timing of the payment, the perfect, almost theatrical neatness of the evidence against her. It felt engineered. Richard had been the one to warn him, the one to provide the evidence. Richard, who stood to gain the most if Project Chimera was compromised, and Julian was forced to rely on him more than ever. He walked over to the secure terminal in his office, the one that was air-gapped from the rest of the world. He began to type, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He wasn't looking for evidence against Clara anymore. He was running a deep-level diagnostic on his own company, searching for a ghost in his own machine. He was hunting for the real traitor. The next day was the annual Ethelred Foundation Gala, a massive charity event held in the atrium of the Ethelred Tower to benefit children with communication disorders. It had been Clara's idea, planned during the hopeful weeks when their new family felt real. Julian had been scheduled to give the keynote address, unveiling a new assistive communication technology inspired by Thomas's progress. Now it was just another obligation, a public performance of a life that felt like a lie. He was in his dressing room, adjusting his tie, when his private terminal beeped. The diagnostic was complete. He opened the file and his blood ran cold. It was a single encrypted audio file, buried deep in Richard's server logs. It was a recording of a phone call between Richard and the Omnicorp programmer. "The money has been transferred," Richard's voice said. The story is planted. Just stick to the script, and you'll be set for life." "What about the girl?" the programmer asked. "Collateral damage," Richard replied, his voice chillingly indifferent. "Now, about the real leak. Are you ready to receive the Chimera source code?" It was all there. Richard hadn't just framed Clara. He was the spy. He had used her as a smoke screen to cover his own treason, selling Ethelred's most valuable secret to their biggest rival. At that exact moment, an alarm began to blare throughout the tower. A robotic, female voice echoed through the halls. "Fire detected in the west sector. Please evacuate immediately." Julian's heart stopped. The gala was in the main atrium, but the children, the beneficiaries of the charity, had been given a special tour. They were in the newly built Quiet Zone, a sensory-friendly wing designed for them to relax away from the noise of the party. A wing designed with input from Clara. A wing located in the west sector. Thomas was there. Julian burst from his room, his mind racing. This was not a coincidence. Richard knew Thomas would be there. He knew Julian would be distracted by the gala. It was the perfect time to transmit the source code, using the fire alarm as cover for the massive data spike. And if something were to happen to the heir of Ethelred in the chaos, it would be a tragedy that would leave Richard Vale as the undisputed successor to the Empire. He sprinted towards the stairwell, dialing his head of security. "Lock down all data transfers out of the building, now, and find Richard Vale." He then dialed a number his fingers remembered against his will. It rang once, twice. He prayed she would answer. Clara picked up, her voice thick with sleep and misery. "What do you want?" "Clara, I was wrong," he said, his voice raw with panic as he descended the stairs, the smell of smoke growing stronger. "I was a foe." The world did not return with a triumphant swell of music, but with the sterile, rhythmic beep of a heart monitor and the pervasive scent of antiseptic that scoured the memory of smoke from his sinuses. Julian sat on a hard plastic chair in the pediatric ward, his soot-stained tuxedo a grotesque mockery of the evening's intended glamour. Across the small, quiet room, Clara was asleep in an identical chair, her head slumped at an angle that promised a fierce ache upon waking, one hand still loosely clutching the edge of Thomas's bed. And in the bed, his son slept a true, deep sleep, his face scrubbed clean, one small hand bandaged from a minor burn. He was safe. The words were a mantra Julian repeated in the hollowed-out cavern of his soul. He is safe. He is safe. But safety was a temporary state, a fragile truce. The fire had been extinguished, but the inferno of Julian's failure still raged within him. He hadn't just misjudged a man. He had misjudged the very nature of his own world. For years he had treated life as a closed system of logic and transactions, a grand algorithm he could master. He had tried to purchase a solution for his son's silence, to command love through provision, to shield himself from grief by encasing it in a mausoleum of memory. He saw now, with the horrifying clarity of a man who has stared into an abyss, that he had built his entire life on a faulty premise. His fortress wasn't designed to keep threats out, it was designed to keep love from getting in. Clara stirred, her moss-green eyes fluttering open. They found his across the sterile space, and for a long moment there was no sound but the beeping of the machine. Her expression was a complex tapestry of exhaustion, relief, and something else, a deep, resonant weariness that was aimed squarely at him. It was not hatred. It was worse. It was the disappointment of a historian who had unearthed a beautiful artifact, only to watch it crumble to dust in her hands. "The doctors said he's fine," she said, her voice a dry rasp. They want to keep him for observation, smoke inhalation. I know, Julian replied, his own voice sounding alien to him, stripped of its usual authority. I spoke with them. Of course you did, she murmured, and the quiet words carried the weight of 1,000 accusations. You, the man in charge, the man with the answers. He deserved it. All of it. He had taken her trust, a thing she had given so cautiously, and he had thrown it into the furnace of his own cynical pride. He had allowed her to be publicly crucified to protect an empire that was already being betrayed from within. The word sorry felt like a pebble in his mouth, too small, too insignificant to ever fill the chasm he had created between them. Clara, he began, rising from his chair, the movement stiff and uncertain. What he did, what I did. She held up a hand, not to stop him, but to ask for a moment's peace. Not now, Julian. Please, not here. Her gaze shifted to Thomas, a fierce, protective love radiating from her that was so pure it made Julian's chest ache. This room is for him. The rest of the world can wait. He sank back into his chair, defeated. She was right. He had spent a decade making everything about himself, his grief, his company, his frustration. This moment, this sacred, quiet space of healing, belonged to his son. He watched as Clara reached out and gently brushed a stray lock of hair from Thomas's forehead. The boy's eyelids flickered, and he made a small sound in his sleep. In that simple, unconscious gesture, Julian saw the family he had almost destroyed. The language they spoke was not one of symbols or words, but of quiet presence, of unwavering care. It was a language he was only now, shamefully, beginning to learn. He had run into a burning building to save his son's life, but he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the true work of saving his son, and himself, had only just begun. The weeks that followed were a study in deconstruction. The Ethelred Tower, a monument to Julian's ambition, was shrouded in scaffolding, its gleaming facade scarred by smoke. The company itself was in turmoil, besieged by federal investigators and a ravenous press. Richard Vale's betrayal was absolute. He had not only attempted to sell Project Chimera, he had systematically embedded backdoors and logic bombs throughout Ethelred's entire infrastructure, a digital scorched earth policy designed to cripple the company if he were ever discovered. Julian found himself in a war room once again, but the enemy was his own creation. He worked with a grim, detached efficiency, not to save his legacy, but to cauterize a wound. He was a surgeon excising a tumor, and he felt nothing but a cold resolve. He handed over complete access to the investigators, dismantled entire departments Richard had built, and personally briefed the board of directors in a meeting that was brutal in its honesty. He told them everything, his own negligence, his blindness, the personal failings that had made the corporate catastrophe possible. He offered his resignation. The board, to his surprise, refused it. They had seen the man on the news, the father covered in soot, carrying his son out of a burning building. They had read the initial reports of Richard's sociopathic ambition. They saw not a failed CEO, but a man who had been profoundly betrayed, and had, in the crucible of that fire, been reborn. They gave him a 6-month leave of absence. They saw a story of redemption, and in the world of corporate narratives, redemption was a commodity that could be spun into gold. Julian cared little for their calculations. He accepted the leave and walked away from the empire he had built without a backward glance. His world had shrunk to the penthouse, which no longer felt like a sterile showcase, but a recovery ward, and at the center of this new, smaller world were Clara and Thomas. Their relationship was not a storybook romance born from the ashes. It was a fragile, complex negotiation. Clara had moved into one of a guest suites, insisting it was temporary, only until Thomas was settled. She refused any form of payment, a quiet, firm boundary that Julian understood he could never again try to cross. He had paid her last check with a bonus, and it had nearly cost them everything. Money was a poison between them now, a reminder of the imbalance he had so carelessly wielded. Instead, he tried to pay his debt in action. He learned to make the oatmeal Thomas liked. He sat for hours, not observing, but participating, as Clara and Thomas worked with a new team of therapists Clara had vetted, who approached Thomas's mind with reverence, not as a problem to be solved. He learned to be patient, to wait for Thomas to form the slow and difficult words, to resist the urge to finish his sentences, to simply provide the space for him to speak. One afternoon, Thomas grew frustrated. The words wouldn't come, his mouth unable to form the shapes his brilliant mind conceived. He slammed his fists on the table, a cry of pure rage tearing from his throat, and swept a sketchpad to the floor. Julian's old instincts flared, the urge to impose order, to demand calm. But he looked at Clara, who simply watched Thomas with compassionate stillness. Julian took a breath, knelt down, and picked up the fallen sketchpad and a piece of charcoal. He didn't speak. He simply drew Thomas's symbol for father, the complex grid. Then he drew the symbol for sad, the maze with the broken path. He pushed the pad towards his son. Thomas stared at the drawing, his ragged breathing slowly calming. He picked up the charcoal. Next to Julian's drawing, he drew his own symbol for angry, a tight, chaotic scribble contained within a box. Then he looked at Julian, his eyes shimmering with unshed tears, and drew one more symbol, a question mark, a pictograph they had designed together. "You get it?" Julian nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "I get it," he said softly. He had met his son where he lived, in the silent, eloquent world of their shared language. It was a bigger breakthrough than any spoken word. Clara watched from the doorway, and for the first time since the fire, the guarded disappointment in her eyes softened into something warmer. He hadn't tried to fix the problem. He had tried to understand the feeling. That evening, she found him in the library, staring out at the city lights. "You were good with him today," she said quietly. "I was just listening," he replied, the admission feeling like a confession. "I was wrong about you," she said, and he turned to face her, his heart seizing. "I thought you were a man who only understood transactions, that you saw the world, and your son, as a series of assets and liabilities." "I was that man," he said, his voice raw with self-recrimination. "That man almost got his son killed. That man broke your trust and let the world tear you apart. He doesn't deserve to be in the same room with either of you." "That man is gone, Julian," she said, taking a step closer. The space between them hummed with unspoken words. "He burned away in the tower. The question is, who is the man who is left?" It was the question that haunted his every waking moment. He was no longer the titan of industry. He was a father, a man adrift, a penitent. He looked at her, at the incredible, resilient woman who had seen the truth of his son when he had been blind, who had guided him through the fire, who had every right to hate him, but had instead chosen to stay and help him heal his broken home. "He is a man," Julian said, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer name, "who is profoundly, irrevocably in love with you, and he knows he has absolutely no right to be." A tear traced a path down Clara's cheek, but she was smiling. It was a small, fragile smile, but it was there. "Well," she whispered, closing the final inch of distance between them. "Maybe he can start by earning it." The trial of Richard Vale was a quiet, clinical affair, held in a federal courthouse far from the glare of news cameras. Julian was called to testify. He saw Richard across the courtroom, impeccably dressed, his face a mask of cold indifference. There was no flicker of remorse in his eyes, only the chilling emptiness of a man who saw other human beings as pawns on a board. As Julian recounted the events, the deception, the frame, the fire, he felt not anger, but a profound and weary pity. Richard was the ghost of who Julian might have become, a man so consumed by the acquisition of power that he had hollowed himself out completely. Richard Vale was sentenced to 25 years in a federal prison, a quiet end to a reign of silent terror. Julian left the courthouse feeling no triumph, only the grim finality of a chapter closed. He poured his energy, his fortune, and his focus into a new creation. It began as a conversation with Clara on the terrace one evening, as they watched Thomas sketch the constellations appearing in the twilight sky. "They tried to fix him," Clara said, her voice soft but laced with a remembered anger. "All those experts and doctors. They saw his silence as a void that needed to be filled with words. They never considered that his silence was already full. It was full of art and logic and a language they were simply too arrogant to learn." An idea began to form in Julian's mind, an idea born from Eleanor's love for the stars, Clara's passion for lost languages, and Thomas's unique, brilliant mind. It was not a corporate project designed for profit, but a mission. 2 years after the fire, on a crisp autumn day, the Eleanor Croft Institute for Symbolic Communication opened its doors. It was a low-slung, beautiful building of glass and warm wood, nestled in a quiet corner of the city, worlds away from the imposing steel of the Ethelred Tower. It was not a clinic. It was a school, a research center, and a sanctuary. Its mission was not to teach non-verbal children how to speak, but to give the world the tools to listen to them. The Institute's logo, projected onto a large screen behind the podium, was a design born from Thomas's sketchpad. It was 3 simple figures, representing a child and 2 adults, held within a single, unbroken circle. Home. Julian stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd of parents, researchers, children, and philanthropists. He was dressed in a simple suit, no longer the armor it once was. He looked down at the front row, where Clara sat, her hand resting on Thomas's shoulder. Thomas was not looking at his father, but at a tablet in his lap, his fingers moving as he drew, perfectly content amidst the crowd. "For most of my life," Julian began, his voice steady and clear, carrying across the hushed auditorium, "I believed that value was something you could measure. In stock prices, in market share, in the height of the buildings you owned. I was wrong. I was taught that lesson by my son, who showed me that a world without words can be more profound than any speech. I was taught it by a woman who showed me that the greatest knowledge is not found in data, but in empathy." He paused, his gaze finding Clara's. Her smile was his anchor. "This institute is named for my late wife, Eleanor, a woman who taught me to look at the stars and see not just gas and fire, but a map of infinite possibility. It is her legacy. But its soul, its founding principle comes from my son Thomas, and its heart comes from its director, Dr. Clara Collins." He looked at Clara, and the entire room seemed to fade away. "They taught me that a person is not a problem to be solved, but a universe to be discovered. Our mission here is simple: to build the telescopes to see those universes, to learn the languages of those silent, brilliant worlds. To listen. Just listen. Later that day, long after the crowds had gone, the three of them stood in the central atrium of the Institute. A vast, interactive screen dominated one wall, showcasing the symbolic languages of the students. Thomas walked up to it, his small finger tracing a path on the cool glass. He looked back at Julian and Clara, who stood hand in hand a few feet away. He had grown so much. His speech was still deliberate, each word chosen with the care of a poet, but the silence no longer owned him. He pointed to Julian. "Grid," he said, his voice soft but sure. Then he pointed to Clara. "Minotaur." He smiled, a rare, brilliant flash of light. "My Minotaur." Clara laughed, a sound of pure joy that echoed in the sunlit space. Thomas then turned back to the screen. With his finger, he drew a new symbol, one Julian had never seen before. It was the unbroken circle of their family, but from its center, countless lines radiated outward, touching other, smaller circles. "What's that one, buddy?" Julian asked, his heart swelling. Thomas looked at them, his stormy grey eyes, once a mirror of Julian's own solitude, now shining with a light all their own. "Home," he said, tapping the central circle. Then he swept his hand across the radiating lines and the other circles. "Making more homes." Julian pulled Clara closer, burying his face in her hair, a wave of gratitude so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. The fire had taken his empire, his pride, his certainty, but it had given him this. It had burned away the fortress and left a foundation. Not a foundation of steel and glass, but of understanding, forgiveness, and a love fluent in every language, spoken and unspoken. They were no longer just a constellation. They were a nascent galaxy, and its light was just beginning to spread.